Good morning, everyone. So while I was rereading these lessons this week, I discovered something completely new that I had never noticed before. After Jesus died, the disciples didn't stay in Jerusalem. They actually fled to Egypt. And I know this because in today's gospel reading, Thomas is in denial. They loved it at 8 o'clock. So that was a joke in case you didn't know. So I'm going to assume that most of you know what I'm about to say, but just in case you don't, I'm going to say it anyway. The readings for each week that we do from the Bible, they come from a 3-year rotating schedule. The first reading is usually from Hebrew Scripture. It's followed by a selection from the Psalms. And the next reading is from the epistles in the New Testament. And the final reading is from the Gospels. Sometimes there's variations on that, but that's usually how it works. And because of the way that the readings are spread out like that, it's really rare that we get to see the same people multiple times on a single Sunday's lessons. But Easter 2, which is today, is one of those variation weeks where the gospel reading is always going to be that gospel reading about Thomas. And the first reading this year is taken from the book of Acts instead of from Hebrew Scripture. So we get to hear about the disciples twice. First, right after Jesus is resurrected, and then when they begin their public ministry. And also, we get a bonus look into the lives of the disciples because today's epistle is attributed to Peter, where most of them were written by Paul. And a quick side note, there is a little debate about whether Peter actually wrote this epistle. There's 3 main theories about it. One is that Peter did write it late in his life. The second is that Peter either asked someone to write it, instructed them to write it, or he said it and they wrote it down. And the third is that one of Peter's disciples wrote it under his name after he had passed away. But whichever one of those you believe, even if he didn't write it, it's certainly comparable to what the disciples would have been teaching near the ends of their ministries. And in these 3 readings, and especially between the Gospel and Acts, we find very different portrayals of the disciples. Now, the reading from Acts is from the day of Pentecost. The flaming tongues have descended, and everyone can speak and understand every language, and the disciples have this amazing energy and great faith and great confidence as they tell the people, this is exactly what just happened, and this is why it happened, and this is what everyone needs to go and do next. But in the story from the Gospel, the disciples don't have any of that confidence when we first meet them. They are hiding in fear for their lives. They have locked themselves into the room, and they're hiding so that they won't also be crucified like Jesus was. So, what happened to the disciples that allowed them to change from anxious John to bold Acts? Well, I think that they found strength in the same way that so many people who live in fear do, by standing together in community with each other through the power of a shared identity. Now, what I mean by a shared identity is a quality that makes us who we are, but also is held in common with a group of our peers, and it implies some degree of shared values. We all have multiple identities that we share with various groups in our life. Common ones are race, gender expression, sexuality. Those are common examples. It could also be things like occupation. It could be religion. It could even be geographic. Now, I don't know all of you very well, but I assume that a few of you at least would identify as Californian. right? Okay, I see some nodding. And if I were to ask those of you who are a Californian, what makes you different from a New Yorker, you can probably already think of a few things. I see some nodding, yes, yes, yes. And you might be thinking, oh, you mean a stereotype. Well, no, I don't mean a stereotype. A stereotype is an identity that is given to someone from the perspective of an outsider. It is put upon a person. An identity comes from within. And because of that, it can be very powerful. For example, in the late 1980s, there was a wave of racist and anti-Semitic hate crimes in the town of Billings, Montana. Now, at first, the people of Billings tried to ignore the problem. They thought if we just don't talk about it, it will just go away on its own. It's a minor thing, it will go away. And frankly, they were afraid of becoming victims themselves. But the attacks just got worse. And black churches were targeted and harassed, and headstones were knocked over in Jewish cemeteries. And in December of 1993, someone threw a brick through the bedroom window of a 5-year-old Jewish boy because it was decorated with a menorah and the Star of David. So the people of Billings knew that they couldn't ignore what was happening anymore, and they found their shared identity. They were citizens of Billings. It was their town, and they weren't going to let this happen. And it gave them the power to fight back. So any vandalism that happened was immediately repaired. Graffiti was painted over, and they put up a giant billboard that said, "Not in our town." And the local newspaper printed menorahs in the paper, full-page size menorahs that everyone, Jewish, Christian, or anything else, they would put in their windows. And initially, the attacks from the white supremacists got stronger. There were more and more of them, but the people rallied. They did not give up. They wanted their town cleaned out of these racists. And so they overcame their fears, and for every menorah that got ripped down, 10 more went up in its place. And it worked. It worked. The racists went back into hiding, and the people were stronger because of what they had gone through together. So for as long as humans have existed, communities have found strength in identity that has allowed them to overcome fear, to endure persecution, and to achieve great things. Historically, black colleges and universities, for example, they weren't created because the existing schools weren't good enough. They were created because black men and women weren't allowed to attend the existing colleges and universities. And one person wouldn't have been able to build those schools, but because they came together under a shared identity with allies, they were able to create institutions that educate and empower young people who wouldn't have had the chance otherwise. And pride festivals, like the one this church marches in every year, they're more than just parties and parades. They're reminders of who we, myself included, the LGBT community are. They're celebrations of our identity as LGBT people. And they include our shared struggles, they include the injustices that we've had to overcome, and they include the work that we still have to do. But we are able to lobby for our rights and to fight discrimination because we have strength in our shared identity and the community it brings. So in today's Gospels, the disciples' fear was justified. They were accomplices of a man who had been put to death for being an enemy of the state. The Romans would have had no problem doing the same thing to any of them. And without their leader, Jesus, what were they supposed to do? They had no identity. But they found their identity again in Jesus when he returned to them, and a week later to Thomas. And he said to them, "As the Father has sent me, so I send you." So from then on, everything that they did for Jesus. That reaffirmed identity allowed Peter to rise from being the disciple who denied Christ 3 times to his intended place as the voice of the disciples and the rock that the church is built on. And we can also do wonderful things when we accept Jesus as our identity. As today's psalm says, and as Peter quoted in Acts, I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not fail. Now, Peter and the other disciples, they didn't stop at identifying with Christ, and neither should we. They made sure that everyone knew that a Christian identity is for everyone. Peter's epistle is written to both Jews and Gentiles, and it assures them of 2 things. The first thing that it assures them of is that even though they didn't know Jesus personally, they're still a part of the Christian identity. And remember what Jesus said, and what I'm sure Peter remembered, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. And the second thing that the epistle assures them of is that because of their Christian identity, they need not live in fear of the Roman persecution that they're facing, because God will be with them and greater treasures await them. So our duty today is to continue this work by going out into the world as the Father sent Jesus, declaring God's peace to all, and letting our Christian identity influence our other identities, so that we can invite other people into identity with Christ. And we can do this by feeding the hungry and by comforting the afflicted. We do this by reaching out to the lonely and the forgotten. We do this by fighting for the oppressed. And when we fall into fear, we can rely on our identity with Jesus and remember that God is with us always, and so we have nothing to fear. So my final thoughts is this: what are your shared identities? How can you let your Christian identity influence your other identities? And how can you invite people into Christian identity with you? Amen.